I'd like to welcome you all tonight. My name is Cara, manager of the Kerry Writers Museum, and we are absolutely delighted to have History Ireland down in Kerry for the first time to host one of their head schools. And this came about last September. We hosted a conference here on the Decade of Commemorations, and John Gibney of History Ireland was speaking at the event, and we were having a chat over a cup of tea, and I suppose things went on from there, and so here we are. So I hope you enjoyed the evening. Just before I introduce our first speaker, I'd just like to mention we have an organisation in this town called North Kerry Reaching Out, and it's primarily a genealogical research community organisation, but we'd like to broaden our remit or focus into, I suppose, historical topics and things like that. So we hope to plan a series of lectures, talks on local history over the next 12 months. So if anybody is interested in getting involved or attending any of those, you can leave your number or email address afterwards, and a sheet of paper out at reception. Now, our first speaker needs no introduction. Minister Jimmy Deanahan, you all know him, our local man here on the ground, and we're delighted that for him, to have the role of Minister for Arts and Culture, particularly here in Listowel, which is a centre of the arts. And Jimmy, as a former history teacher, has a huge interest in his history, obviously historical events. And I know he's involved in many projects in this area in developing, I suppose, our past heritage, that he's really keeping it alive in Listowel. So, ladies and gentlemen, Minister Jimmy Deanahan.
Thank you very much, Cara, and I'm delighted to be here this evening. First of all, I'd like to welcome Tommy Graham and John Gibney from History Ireland, and just to thank them for coming to Listowel. I suppose it's appropriate that you would have included Listowel in your itinerary. Absolutely. At this stage, you've been to all parts of Ireland, including Belfast, and they've operated the head schools. I actually opened one in Listowel some time ago, and they've been very successful. And also, they do this very fine magazine. It's a great reference for historical data, information. It's very professionally written, let me say, based on primary sources. So it's a really good publication, and thank you for including one for everyone here this evening. I'm just delighted that you're here for a number of reasons. I'm in charge of the Decade of Commemorations. I was asked by the Taoiseach to do that in 2011. And a number of events have happened since. We're following the timeline. First of all, we started with the introduction of the Home Rule Bill in the House of Commons in April the 11th, 1912. And just to mark that event, we had a special conference down in Waterford where we acknowledged the contribution of John Redmond, and also the Taoiseach and the Prime Minister, they opened an exhibition over in Westminster that later came to the National Library in Dublin and also the City Hall in Belfast. Then we had a major event to commemorate the Dublin lockout. That was last summer in O'Connell Street in Dublin. That was organised by ICTU, and it involved a reenactment of the lockout and the scenes in Dublin last August. Actually, it was the day before the Dublin-Kerry football game. I remember there were a lot of Kerry people on O'Connell Street. I could see them from the stage, and maybe it upset them a bit that they inspired Dublin. And so that was a very successful event as well. It was very well done, and also there was a replica of one of the old tenements in Frederick Street. Some of you may have seen it. And overall, there was a major tapestry done, and there was involvement of school children and so forth. So it was, I must say, it was very well received overall. And there was huge involvement from SIP2 and IC2 and from education and from all sources, and obviously the Labour Party as well. Then in November, there was an event in the Rotunda. It was a state event just to acknowledge and to commemorate the setting up of the volunteers. And as you know, I suppose the two prime movers in that particular meeting was Owen McNeill and Tom Kettle. But one of the people behind it was Dee O'Rahilly, who has very strong connections, as you know, with this town. He was born in Ballylongford, and his first cousins just lived across the street there, the O'Reillys, Alfred, and a huge family, all very distinguished people. Then the next event that we are doing is just next week, and that's again the foundation of Coming Them On. And the person leading that is Mary McAuliffe, Dr. Mary McAuliffe from the WA. She's the chairperson of the Women's History Foundation, and actually her grandmother was in Coming Them On, and some of her aunts were in it as well. So there's going to be an event in Wynn's Hotel. We're unveiling a plaque there. The president is Lena Reid on the grave of the founder of Coming Them On. And also there's a conference on next weekend where all of the, I suppose, the experts in, I suppose, on Coming Them On will be given papers, and it's quite exciting. It's going on for 2 days. I know is it booked out or not, but certainly it's worth a visit if you're in Dublin. And then we're going to continue to follow the timeline later on this year. Actually, we will have the commemoration of the outbreak of World War I. This gives us a chance to, I suppose, commemorate our shared history in the island of Ireland. There will be shared events between North and South, cross-border, between unionist population, nationalists in Northern Ireland and with the Republic of Ireland, and that there are a number of events organised for that. And then, following the timeline, there'll be a number of major battles, as you know, over the next Gallipoli, Messina and others between this and 1916. And the primary focus obviously will be in 1916, Easter Sunday, Easter week. And you may have seen last week that on Post they have got planning permission now to do an exhibition centre in the GPO in Dublin. And there's a very good space there. It's an open yard that where they can put in a museum into without disrupting the main buildings. So that's going to start, I would say, within the next 3 or 4 months, and it'll be ready for 1916. Also, there's money put aside for the, I suppose, restoration of Chalcon Piercig in Connemara. There are some issues there about land ownership. It's on a commonage, but hopefully we can get over those. Sean McDiarmid's house up in Leitrim has been restored. We're working on putting a proper car park there and an entrance to it. And down in Cloughjordan, the house of Thomas McDonough has been restored, and there's a nice interpretive centre there. So they are some of the events that, that we have planned and that have happened already. Also, I was just looking at it this evening. It's quite actually interesting. We launched a website some time ago on just a decade of commemorations, and also there's a paper, an online newspaper, Century Ireland, that some of you probably, you're looking at this probably at the moment, but it's quite interesting. So all of the events that happened in Ireland 100 years ago, if you just Google Century Ireland, they will come up. I Googled it this evening, and there's some very interesting things on it. And I remember Googling it some time ago, and John Redmond actually was at that famous game between Kerry and Louth when they played, first time 15-a-side was played, and it totally changed the game. Up until then, it was 18-a-side. And because of the extra space and all the rest, the game totally changed and became very exciting. And he was asked afterwards, this is all in Century Island, what did he think of it? And he thought it was a much better game than soccer or rugby that particular time. Of course, we all agree with him. Maybe hurling is better than that. So it's really very interesting, and I would just suggest that you would look at it. Then there are obviously lectures going on all over the country. The National Library, the National Museum, they're all, the Abbey Theatre, they're all doing different things for the decade of commemorations, with a major emphasis on obviously the Declaration of the Republic and Easter week. So it's quite exciting, and I'm delighted that I'm part of this. I taught history myself for 8 years in Tarbert, so I have a particular history or interest in history. I think it's important to note as well that there'll be a number of events organised here in Kerry. Tomorrow I'm launching a programme in Killarney in Muckross House, where the trustees of Muckross House are launching their programme of various events over the next 10 years. And the Library in Tralee have a number of events planned as well, and the Kerry Historical Society. So there'll be a large number of events organised to commemorate this period, both nationally and locally here as well. Just on the whole issue, I suppose, of primary sources, recently the Taoiseach and myself, we launched the Pensions Archive in the GPO, and I would strongly recommend that you, actually in the first 2 hours, there were 120,000 hits on the Pensions Archive. So there's really great interest in it, and it's going back to the primary source. These are people who applied for pensions, and they had to say what they did in the War of Independence. So they're saying everything they actually did, whether it was opening, trenches, whether it was cutting trees or whatever. But they're all in it, and it's a fantastic source, and I'm sure the historians amongst us here would agree that you could nearly rewrite the history of this period, but they're really very, very important. Also, the statements, over 2,000 statements were taken, and they're quite fascinating as well, from people who participated in the War of Independence, and also actually in establishing the volunteers. Very interesting testament from Ernest Blight, actually. He came down to Kerry to learn Irish. Then he was sent down by D. O'Reilly to organise the volunteers there, and is quite revealing actually about being back in Menard and Listowel and just doing the, I suppose, when they were organising the volunteers back there at that time, the drilling and so on, is quite interesting. So there are a large number of sources there. There are lots of things happening. As, I suppose, the chairman of the commemoration group, we have an all-party committee. There are representatives there from all the party in the Dáil, so I wanted to keep it very inclusive. I want, of course, that we're tolerant about everything that we do, and that we are respectful to different opinions as well. I think that as a country we can commemorate this together. The split didn't take place until the treaty, so up to the treaty we were all on the same team, so it's very important that we commemorate it jointly, and we respect different points of views. To date, up in Northern Ireland, there were 3 events. First of all, Balmoral, it went off without incident. Then the Ulster Covenant Day, again it went off without incident, and the establishment of the Ulster Volunteers. There was no sideshow or incidents. So to date, people have been very mature about commemorating the various events that happened 100 years ago. So I would certainly hope to keep that spirit going, and so that people can look at this in a dispassionate way. we can look back 100 years later and just respect people's different opinions, whatever they were. We can talk about them. We can look back at the primary source and see what people said, not maybe the interpretation of what they said, but what they really said. So these people were extraordinary people. The women, for example, the women that set up Cumann na mBan were quite extraordinary women. And I know they came from the Land League, and then in the Horgan, then became Cumann na mBan, but they were quite extraordinary women. They certainly deserve to be looked at closely, to be analysed in various ways. Also, when you look at the signatories of the Easter Rising, these were really intelligent people. They were all poets. Every one of them had, I suppose, wrote poetry, they wrote prose, they were involved in education. People like Padraig Pierce, Thomas MacDonagh, all of them were highly qualified individuals. So they were extraordinary people, and it's very, very important, I think, that they're commemorated properly, that their role in developing what we have now, setting up our republic, will be recognised and will be properly commemorated in every sense of the word. So I'm really looking forward to listening to our four speakers tonight. I'll hand you back to Tommy to introduce them, but just to say that we're very fortunate to have really four fine speakers here with a great pedigree themselves and all published authors as well in history. So thank you all for coming here. Thank you, Cara, for making the facility available. It's an ideal place for this type of event. So I'll hand you back to Tommy, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister, and I'd just like to acknowledge the support of the Minister and his department for putting on this event tonight. Good evening, history lovers, and welcome to the latest History Ireland Hedge School. This, of course, is a rescheduled hedge school. It was meant to happen back in February, but the weather turned nasty, and we were forced to postpone it.
The night of the big wind.
A very big wind, and hailstones, and everything else you're having yourself. Tonight, by the way, I'm your hedge school master, Tommy Graham, and I think it's appropriate we're in the home of the master, Brian McMahon, the master. The topic tonight is Before Banna, Politics, Society and Sport in Kerry, 1912 to 1916. Now, Roger Casement's landing and arrest at Banna Strand has assured Kerry a place in the narrative and song of the 1916 Rising. The county was equally prominent in the War of Independence and in the Civil War, which was particularly bitter, of course, in this county. But what was happening before 1916? Was Kerry always a bastion of republicanism, a bastion of Gaelic football, indeed? What was the level of support for the Irish Parliamentary Party or for British Army recruitment? So to discuss these and related matters, we have assembled an international panel here, all the way from San Francisco via Cork. That may be the only mention of Cork we get in here tonight, by the way. We have John Borgonovo of UCC, author of The Dynamics of War and Revolution, Cork 1916 to 1918. And then beside me here, of course, we have the local man here, Richard McElligott, author of Forging a Kingdom, the GAA in Kerry, 1884 to 1934. And then immediately beside me, just up the road from in Tralee, Tim Horgan, who's the author of The Men Will Talk to Me, the Kerry Interviews by Ernie O'Malley. And then finally, just to show we're very ecumenical, that we do allow people from across the Shannon Estuary, we have the bannerman himself, Padraig Óg Ó Ruairc, and he's the author, of course, of Revolution, a photographic history of revolutionary Ireland, 1913 to 1923. And by the way, all these publications are for sale outside, and who knows, the author may sign them and turn them into collector's items before the evening is due. So, Richard, you're the local man here on the panel, so I want to come to you first. What I want to try and do is to sketch, an idea of what Kerry was like before the First World War, before the 1916 Rising. So maybe if we start maybe, second half of the 19th century, if you give us let's leave the politics to one side for a minute and just give maybe a social and economic sketch of what sort of a place this was, a century and a half ago.
Okay, Tommy, thanks. Okay, well, obviously Kerry, much like today, in the 19th century was an agriculturally dominated county. You had a population of about 179,000 people, predominantly rural. Only about 10% of Kerry's population lived in urban centres. The three big ones obviously dominated: Killarney, Tralee and Listowel. As I said, agriculture was very much the predominant industry economy in Kerry. Something like 72% of the male workforce, the average age of the male workforce, 72% of them were involved in agriculture. And that's not, of course, including the thousands of other people involved in secondary industries that were all geared towards the agricultural economy. Kerry, as you probably know, has one of the wettest climates in Ireland, so that was actually very beneficial for grass growth, hence why beef and butter were the main agricultural products in Kerry at this time. Also, of course, you had some fishing in the west, in the seaboards in the West Kerry and South Kerry, and of course you had the development of a tourism industry in the likes of Killarney.
Already by that stage?
Oh, very much. I mean, obviously when Queen Victoria came in 1861, that's the big thing. That kicks off tourism in Kerry. Kerry's put on the Victorian map. Obviously, if it's good enough for the Queen, it's good enough for everyone else in England, basically. So that's the start, really, of Killarney as, heaven's reflex, as they called it at that time. So that's really the economic background to Kerry at this time. An agricultural economy, dominant agricultural economy, mass emigration as well. I mean, Kerry, Tipperary, Clare are probably the three counties most affected by emigration in the 40 or 50 years after the famine. But despite that, despite contributing almost maybe 140,000 people from Kerry alone leaving in those 40 or 50 years, Kerry actually has a very high birth rate. So the population stays stable, even though there's this mass immigration. And Kerry's unusual in that sense, because whereas in the rest of Ireland the birth rate is declining, in Kerry it's very much on the increase. So Kerry, an agricultural economy, an agricultural society, on the periphery, it's fair to say,
Richard, tell me this, what was the landholding structure?
The landholding structure, again, Kerry's unusual in that land was concentrated among a relatively small number of landowners. You had about 26 major landowners who, between them, carved up about 2/3 of the land in Kerry. Of course, you had the names you're probably familiar with: Lord Kenmare, Lord Listowel, the Crosbys in Artford, Colonel Dennehy around Tralee, and
did they live locally, or were they absentee?
In the case of the likes of the Dennehy's and Crosbys, they were local. Lord Listowel, often absentee. Lord, it was his notorious land agent Sean Hussey who would have taken control of his lands. Lord Kenmare very much situated in South Kerry. Now, tenant relations with their landlords were pretty amicable up until the late 1870s, because from the 1850s to the 1870s, there was a bit of an agricultural boom in Ireland at this time. So prices, there's huge demand in the British market for butter and beef, which is the main products in Kerry. So landowners and tenant farmers were making a lot of profit. So because of this, times are good. There isn't those tensions you'll see, but what happens, of course, is in the late 1870s, there's a worldwide economic recession. Demand for agricultural products coming out of Ireland declined sharply, and that's the beginning of it.
I'll go back to the land war in a second, right, which we will come on to shortly, but I want to go to Tim first. Tim, like, when would you say, if you like, modern history begins in Kerry?
I suppose history really begins at the famine. The famine almost wiped the slate clean. A barony like this in North Kerry lost 40% of its population over 10 years, which was a huge amount, so there was a big social upheaval. The result, apart from the death and that, was a massive emigration. And emigration kind of worked both ways, really. People went west to a new world, which was a republic, where people could advance very quickly, and where their ideals or their culture was not suppressed. And these ideals came backwards as well. So a generation or two after the famine, people were more educated. There was the national school system was there, and Kerry had a long history of education anyway through head schools and that, and this was noted by outside travellers. So there was a basis of education there, and so these ideals that had come from America in the form of Fenianism or the Irish Republican Brotherhood, these found a ready audience here.
From what you're saying, Tim, does that mean that idea of peripherality has been overstated? In other words, that because you have a large degree of emigration, it means you have ideas coming in from all over?
Yes, in fact, the peripherality really is a bonus to the county because people left and they came back. If they didn't come back, they sent money back. And so there was never a break between the emigrant and his country. And so there was not this disconnect that you had maybe with immigration in other countries like Germany and that. The Irish, once they went to America or even to Australia, they still kept contact with their own country, and often they would return, bringing money with them, bringing ideals with them, and bringing this sense of egalitarianism, that the people were actually equal, which was kind of a novel concept in an era where people's lives were dominated by landlords and that.
Now, in 1858, the Irish Republican Brotherhood was founded. What sort of an impact did that make on the county?
I suppose it found ready ears here anyway. Down through the centuries, people in various rebellions would have been moved to the peripheries, whether these were the mountains of Sliabh on the eastern side of the county, or the mountains in South Kerry. And when they were displaced like that, they brought their ideals with them, their religion with them, and that sense of freedom. As times improved, often these families moved down into the lowlands again. So there was that sense of rebellion, that sense of separatism there all the time, and the Irish Republican Brotherhood put a format onto that really, and this really took hold more so in South Kerry, in the urban populations there amongst the tradesmen. You had more and more tradesmen as the society was becoming more complex than that. And even James Stephens, the famous Fenian, when he was on the run, it was to South Kerry he came, to the Kilmare, Killarney area, so that...
I was taken by what Richard said, that about what 10% of the population were urban-based, and I always understood that Fenianism was an urban phenomenon. So how can that dichotomy be explained?
Well, I suppose the essence really of Fenianism was separatism, really, whether that was the separatism of the poor man on the hillside and his family reminiscing on the past when Gaelic Ireland was their country, or whether it was the artisan in the town, giving it a kind of more principled, more formatted thing. It was essentially the same thing, and one acted as a catalyst to the other later on in the land wars. So
are you suggesting it's more separatist than Republican, if you know what I mean?
Oh yes, I think that would be, it was a separatist thing, and really the names have always changed, but really most of the republicanism here would be kind of a Brit-South separatism, really,
Now, of course, the Fenianism links up with the agrarian situation, with the New Departure and the founding of the Land League in the late 1870s. Now, that obviously then transforms the situation. Padraig, do you want to come in on that one? I mean, how does that affect matters?
I suppose these things, there's Land Acts introduced and there's change in land ownership, but these problems are still rumbling on in the background. As you said, there's people looking up at the big houses of Lord Kenmare, Lord Kerry or whoever, and they're not happy about it. And you talked about people looking back and discussing stories and the kind of the old Gaelic culture, and we used to be in the ruined castle up there. They would also look back and say, that farm used to be ours and someone kicked us out, and these grievances kind of rumbled over. And I had a look, because I'm from Clare and wouldn't be as familiar with the Kerry history. I had a look at the police reports for Ireland in the early 1900s, and there was quite a lot of lawlessness, and it's stuff like firing into people's houses, maiming animals, damaging roads or property that are owned by landlords or unpopular tenants. And I had a look at Listowel in particular, and there's some great ones. Dispute over a quarry at Ballintor, shots fired into a house. Shots fired at a house in Ahamona, Listowel, in dispute over a farm. This one a bit racier. An employer in Listowel was shot at in a romantic dispute over a servant girl.
Nowhere near Listowel.
35 cattle stolen from a farm at Ballyconry, Listowel. Horse belonging to the Knight of Kerry, shot dead at Ballinruddery. Mr. Chamber, the manager of the Provincial Bank in Listowel, robbed of £780, 5 shillings and 2 pence in August 1913. Maybe he took it himself, we don't know. And then my favourite, there's a house being built on a disputed farm was demolished, the day of planning permission. And then Father Beasley shot at in Drummadore in row over appointment of new schoolmistress. So you do get this agrarian stuff spilling on over the time, but by you come up to 1900, 1910, the RIC, who are pretty much the British colonial police force in Ireland, are saying that the press is considered moderate. You know, it's not that extreme. The Fenians are there, but they're bubbling along underground. And they said that local relations between landlord and tenant are generally good.
Mm-hmm. Richard, who are these guys that were hawking cattle and burning down, causing mayhem?
And a lot of times they were, like you said, displaced tenant farmers and so on. I mean, the interesting thing about Kerry is the most violent county in Ireland in the 1880s in terms of agrarian crime. And just to explain why that happens, like I said, there's a recession, a worldwide recession. Because things have been so good for so long, landlords decide that, look, we haven't increased rents in about 20 years. It's time to put them up. Everyone's doing well. Let's get a bigger cut of the pie. What happens, of course, is in 1878, 1879, massive economic recession, and all of a sudden...
This sounds familiar.
Yeah, very familiar. History repeats itself always. But I mean, right at the moment, they start to put up the rents. The agricultural economy collapses. And so what you have now is farmers who can't afford rents that have been massively increased, and of course evictions rise because of that. And because of that, this is the beginnings of this agricultural agrarian violence. And so by the 1882, 1883, Kerry is the most, as is described in the Kerry Sentinel, the local nationalist paper, the most rack-rented, the most criminally agitated county in all of Ireland. So much so that martial law has to be declared here in 1885, and that the RIC, have to send down a special force of 300 policemen to actually stop what Padraig was going on about, this maiming and so on. And it is, in a lot of ways, it's displaced. Obviously, there's the IRB are involved in it to a certain extent, but more often than not, it's those moonlighters, those displaced.
So it's more
farmers.
of a spontaneous thing.
It is an organised thing. And I mean, it's like you said, it goes back generations. Like you said, to the famine, before the famine, that used to be my farm, this used to be my land, and so on. And what you find a lot is that farmers who, a landlord has kicked out one farmer, another farmer comes in, gets the land, and all of a sudden he is shunned in the community, he is shot at. There's bullets through his door and so on. He's a person non grata in the local community.
The Land League, of course, and the Land War is what catapults Parnell and his party into prominence. What was it, just going back before Parnell, the Home Rule Party developed, what was the complexion of parliamentary politics in Kerry, say, before the Land War? Before the Land War, you would have had the likes of the Harringtons. You had Tim Harrington, who would become secretary of the Irish Parliamentary Party. He founded the Kerry Sentinel newspaper in Tralee. They came from West Cork originally. So it was always broadly nationalist, broadly in line with the Irish Parliamentary Party, certainly in North Kerry anyway, and West Kerry. So there was some unionist candidates, but mostly, predominantly was nationalist candidates, once the Irish Parliamentary Party was organised and started going. Do I take it from that then, once it gets up and running, there will be relatively few contested elections then? Very few, yes, very few. In the 1880s, when Charles Stewart Parnell is at his height, like I said, Timothy Harrington becomes secretary of the Irish Parliamentary Party. His brother, Edward, who takes over the running of the Kerry Sentinel, he is also elected MP as well. So it is very much a Irish parliamentary safe seat in Kerry to launch. John, yeah.
One thing we got to keep in mind is just literacy, I think, is huge, and mass literacy. And so people are all of a sudden consuming huge. The newspaper readership in Ireland in this period was through the roof, and people were mobilized. There was also a long tradition of civil disobedience. There was a long tradition of suspicion towards the law. Keep in mind that prior to the famine, legal proceedings were all in English, and most of the Irish population spoke Irish. A lot of writs had to be enforced by police, armed police, backed up by armed troops. So you had a long tradition of opposition to the police force, of kind of a people's law, and this is kind of, all this stuff is channeled, and then you have this growing kind of radicalization in some of the urban centers, and a lot of it's around people who are like shop assistants, kind of this new urban people, people who work independently, artisans, and they become kind of the backbone of this new movement, and they're going to continue to be this backbone of kind of the radical voice going for the next 30, 40, 50 years. And it's a lot of times the same people, families being handed down, generationally.
Tim, you want to come in there?
I'm not sure that the landlords were driven really by landless tenants. In fact, some of this can actually be propaganda and a kind of a scare tactic that this was the land for the people. Everybody was going to get thrown out and it was all going to be redistributed. But in fact, this wasn't true. We'll say in Milltown, one of those men arrested was actually the local doctor. Most of the area where the land wars were at their most intense around Castle Island and the Fireys, and that McElligott area is actually some of the best land in the county. So it wasn't just landless tenants. Most of those were actually gone to America anyway. It was driven by a mixture of that old separatist ideal, which mixed in and catalyzed that land league thing, and it suited very rural communities very well. These were the land leagues were driven, or the land wars were driven by the Moonlighters, which were small bands of men always from one local area, very, very tightly knit, so much so that the British establishment, the RIC, found it very difficult to penetrate them, and they flooded the place with police, and the police were billeted on the people. There was this oppression of outsiders coming into the community, which in turn generated more dissension, and so the whole thing took on a life of its own. So I don't think it was landless peasants looking for land. It was a mixture of a kind of a more educated
More middle
class.
element.
More middle element,
yeah,
yes.
yeah.
Another thing you have at this time as well, of course, is because there is a recession in the world economy and in Britain as well, emigration slows down considerably in the 1880s. And so what you find is you do get a sense of a generation of young men, frustrated men, who've no access to land, no access to employment, who in ordinary times might have taken the boat, but because that safety valve has gone to a certain extent in the 1880s, they're hanging around, corner boys as they'd be called, hanging around church chapels and so on, looking for something to do, maybe looking for a way to unleash their frustrations.
So that's why they start playing football.
And this, this is also what happens in the Revolutionary decade. In the First World War, that's exactly what happens again. Emigration is stopped, and you have a bunch of young men hanging around.
These would be people who would have usually had the get up and go to leave the place.
Yes.
That would have had the education to leave the place, and now they're stuck here. So what do you do?
Now,
Take on the establishment.
Richard, I want to move on to the GAA, but just before that, just very briefly, very, very briefly, what way did Kerry cleave on the Parnell split?
Well,
Pro or anti?
It was pro Parnell, really. I mean, Knocknagoshel did arise.
So that's the minority position.
It would be the minority position, and really it set I suppose the Parnell split was the first big split in Ireland. In a nation of splitters, that was really the first one. And Kerry really went with Parnell, and that famous barrier, or that famous banner, Arise Knocknagoshel, take your place among the nations of the earth, was really the pro-Parnell party in Knocknagoshel there. So there was this sympathy towards Parnell. He was a rebel, and this was a county of would-be rebels.
But but that wasn't universal. I mean, very famously, there was a priest in Abbeydorney who, when the Parnell candidates were defeated in the 1893 general election and the anti-Parnell formed a government, he described anyone in
Abbeydorney
who voted for Parnell were nothing more than bastard makers. So there was dissent in some places.
Clerics in Kerry were very fond of calling people bastards.
The men of cloth usually took the wrong side.
They did.
Now, Richard, let's go on to the subject of your book, which is the GAA. Let's get on to the really important stuff. GAA is founded in 1884. When does it first make an impact in this part of the world?
Almost immediately. The first major GAA event happened in Tralee in June of 1885. Michael Cusack founds the GAA. The whole reason for founding the GAA is he is sick of, one, the anglicisation of Irish sports. he sees this again as just another trend in this encroaching Anglicisation of Irish society. More importantly, though, athletics meetings, sports meetings in Ireland at the time, they're very much for the middle class and upper class. There's actually laws put in place to bar people, working class people who have to go out and work and have a job. So what he wants to do is he wants to take back athletics. And remember, it's the Gaelic Athletic Association. That's what it's named. And very much in his first 2 or 3 years, it's about athletics. Hurling and football become an afterthought, and they come in 2 or 3 years later, really. That's when they're focused on. What he wants is athletics for the ordinary person. What he decides to do is, where the modern-day Austin Stacks Park is in Tralee, that was called the Tralee Sports Ground. It was actually one of the finest, if not the finest, sports venues in Ireland at this time. It might seem unusual, but it actually was. Even better than Ball's Bridge. And the sporting press described it even better as Ball's Bridge or Lansdowne Road. Tralee, for the last 10 or 20 years, held a very successful annual athletics championship. And what Michael Cusack decided to do is if he came down to Tralee, and the same day this athletics annual athletics championship was going on by the old crowd, the elitist crowd, if he put on a GA meeting at the same time and made sure that the people went to that, he could ensure the success of the GA, in a massive propaganda coup. And that's exactly what happened. So if anyone's familiar with Tralee, where the Greyhound Stadium is now, he put on his GA athletics meeting that same day. And what happens is the establishment, if you want, the landlord-run games, which is in the sports ground Tralee, attracts all the gentry, the well-to-dos, might attract 100 other people. Whereas there's claims that up to 10,000 people believe that or believe it not, but a massive, massive crowd come to the GA sports events. And what that does is that signifies that Kerry is for the GA, that one of the most prominent athletic centres in Ireland has been taken for the GA, and from that it takes off. And over the course of the next summer, 150 separate athletic meetings in Ireland are founded by the GA. So much so, in fact, that Henry Dunbar, who is the secretary of a rival athletics association called the Irish Amateur Athletics Association, which is set up to try and wrestle back control of the GA, so successful is the GA that he is forced to kind of try and offer his hand in peace to Michael Cusack. So he writes to Michael Cusack a very long letter saying, can we please stop all this bickering and join together? And Michael Cusack's famous reply is, dear sir, I received your letter this morning and burnt it. So that's the kind of guy Michael Cusack was. But the battle lines were drawn at that stage.
Well, keep in mind too that what's happened in industrial countries around the world is there's leisure time. So people are now a lot of people are living in urban areas. A lot of people are have evenings free, and a lot of people have Sundays free. So they have leisure time. And from this, there's also a transportation revolution where you have telegraph, so you can set up fixtures. Newspapers that advertise and promote sport, and there's international literacy, so people can read newspapers, and you have all this communications kind of to facilitate. You have bicycles, so people can get to fixtures. You have trains, so people can take trains. So all this stuff takes place, and this is not just an Irish phenomenon. This is international, and this is when rugby set up. This is when sports like basketball or soccer become popularized, and all these new sports, tennis. The Olympics are founded all in these same decades all across Europe and North America. So it's just kind of an Irish solution to an international problem.
Yeah, and that's an important point that John makes, that I suppose we have this idea of the GAA being very much an insular thing. It isn't. It copies the model that's been there from rugby in Britain. It copies what's happening in Britain. But as you said, it molds it so it's an Irish solution. Most famously, of course, Sunday play. Sabbath, It's unthinkable in England with the Church of England to play on a Sunday. So rugby and soccer, cricket played on Saturday. Of course, that can't work in an agricultural-dominated economy like Ireland. Sunday's the only day off. So Michael Cusack and Maurice Davitt, when they found the GA, Sunday's the day. So automatically, it skews that model to fit in with what you'd call the sporting constituency in Ireland. It becomes the people's game.
So, and how successful is the GA then in the early days, say the 1890s?
Well, of course, what happens, we talked about the parallel split. The GAA is a sporting phenomenon in Ireland. By 1889, there's already more than 700 clubs. Now, to put that in context, at the same time, there's 124 soccer clubs and about 50 rugby clubs in Ireland. So, in the space of 4 or 5 years, the GAA just expands right across Ireland. But, of course, the problem for the GAA is politics. it gets involved in politics. And the parnell split, no more than for any other section in our society, the parnell split has a detrimental impact on the GA. The GA is torn asunder because of the parnell split. Yeah. And not only that, of course, again, recession. A massive recession hits Ireland in the 1890s, beginning in 1890. The same thing that happened in 1879. Massive agricultural depression, and of course, the rise of mass immigration. 10% of the Irish population leave Ireland in that decade. Over 716,000 people leave. And of course, who are the people that are going? Young men, active men, the lifeblood of GA clubs. So they have to deal with the economic situation, and they have to deal with the political mess of the parnell split and clubs and officials at each other's throat over it.
Now, Tim, just linking this up with our earlier discussion about Fenianism.
Yes.
They were the expert infiltrators of other organisations.
Yes.
How did they play out in this situation?
Well, I suppose the Fenians, or those with a militant separatist background, they would be more committed, first of all, so that if there was any organisation being set up, they were the people that were going to get involved. A lot of them were, as we've said, artisans. They were good with pens. You know, they were the secretaries. They were the organisers. So it almost fell into their laps, really, that that we'll call them the Republicans or the Fenians would be infiltrate, I suppose, is one word. But in fact, it became almost natural that these people who were motivated would gravitate that way. And it's probably fair to say that a lot of the GA was set up really as an anti-British sports organisation. So even if you had very little interest in sport, you probably gravitate towards GA anyway, because and then so you had like-minded people there as well. So the organisation certainly was ripe for Fenian influence or for separatist influence.
And were they prominent then within the GAA?
Oh, I suppose they would have been kind of from early on, and maybe a lot of the younger men. I suppose separatism really is something that appeals to the young, and a lot of the footballers and hurlers at the time, that they would have been the men of ideals, the men with the red hot blood. And it's not surprising that the separatist ideal from the secretaries and the chairmans of the club would find willing ears amongst the younger players. So a lot of the early Gaelic footballers who came to prominence, like Austin Stack and maybe Dick Fitzgerald and that, these were very good Gaelic footballers, but they were also IRB men.
Now, I just want to move on to another aspect of this, because what you're still painting to me now, looking at this from the outside, is an actually or potentially radical or place, right? At the same time, though, you have the Munster Fusiliers, you have British Army recruitment. I mean, what's the level of recruitment there? I mean, in other words, is there a contradictory thing going on here where people will be active in GA, active Fenians, but you still have members of the same families, joining the British Army, joining the Munster Fusiliers in particular? Well,
there is, I suppose, as a Clareman, I think Clare won its first hurling All-Ireland in 1914, and thankfully no one looked at Rule 21, because about 7 of the guys were British Army reservists. But yeah, you have, the Royal Munster Fusiliers, you mentioned there, Tommy. We talked about the poverty there, and the big release for that, and another form of emigration is join the British Army. The old phrase is, join the army, travel the world, meet interesting people from ancient and diverse cultures, and kill them. Basically, and we can go back, if we go to talking about the First World War, I can come back to recruitment and the role the poverty plays in it. But another thing is adventure. This is your chance to get out there and see the world. We talked about the press there. There were 12 different local newspapers in Kerry at the time, and all of them, except for the very unionist ones, carried adverts saying, if you need to get out of the country, come to Canada, come to Australia, we've land here. The eldest son was getting the farm, small as it may have been. The second eldest wasn't going to get it at all. And the Royal Munster Fusiliers had Ballymullen Barracks in Tralee was their base. And a huge part of being recruited was watching guys march up and down the street and the pageantry and the pomp. And we all watched war movies at home as kids and ran around with wooden sticks, with guns. And kids did this. They emulated it. There's a reason why the British Army marched out to Sunday services every morning with their band. It was to influence, to recruit the locals. Not everyone was singing the Saxon shilling. And another reason people joined up quite often had little to do with king and country. You're back to excitement and adventure, as that famous IRA leader from Kerry, Tom Barry, who is regarded as a Cork man but is from Killorgan, he said during the First World War, he said, I had no knowledge of nations great or small. I joined the army to get foreign travel to get a gun and feel like a man, and that's what it was like. And bubbling away in the background of all this stuff, you've got the GA, it's part of a bigger cultural revival, you've got changes in land ownership, you have this tension, and the Irish language or the GA or Gaelic revival is part of it. Do we see ourselves as British? Do we see ourselves as Irish? And politics at the time, in Britain, it's liberal, it's conservative, maybe a few Labour. In Ireland, it's all nationalist or unionist. And the political situation really is dominated by the Nationalist Party. What they're looking for is home rule. Now, in the late 1800s, this had come up. Gladstone, the British Prime Minister, had been a guy who was actually interested in home rule because he thought it was a good idea. When he's gone, home rule is just shelved, and it doesn't come up again until there is a need for numbers. Hugely important in politics. The balance of power in Westminster was held by Irish MPs, and suddenly, at the time that all these big changes and tensions are boiling over, this crisis develops in Ireland over home rule.
Well, and keep in mind, too, when you talk about the nationalist parties, constitutional nationalism, where the idea is Irish autonomy and home rule will be achieved through the House of Commons through British legislation. That party was by far the dominant party in Irish politics. It was kind of had a broad tent, which made sense after the Parnell split, so they wanted to keep everybody on side. But it was gravitating towards the British establishment. It was becoming more establishment. The separatists, the people who were really, flying the flag, the people who were involved in the cultural revival, they were very much a minority. They were very much marginalized. They had no real power. A lot of people considered them cranks. They took a lot of abuse. They were not considered realistic or pragmatic about politics. And so they were very much doing their own thing, kind of in small little hidden communities. Most of these people were totally unknown by 1914, 1915, the Easter Rising. Nobody had heard of most of these people. And so what they were doing was toiling away. Now we see, it seems really obvious, they were building up a leadership cadre, they were getting momentum. But at the time, they just seemed like they were just total extremists without any kind of route to power, without any real meaningly, what we call social capital today. And so that's kind of where you're at by the early years of the 20th century.
And if you actually look at what home rule was, at this time Ireland was seen as an integral part of Britain. Ireland was considered as British as Norfolk. Basically, the Union flag flew over an RIC barracks in every town, and parties like the Home Rule Party, used the Union flag. We think of them as nationalists. Yes, they did want an amount of separation, but there was a Home Rule councillor or nationalist councillor in Galway, and he said even if we could get complete independence, we wouldn't want to give up all those virtues of empire. They do quite well for us. And we often talk about Home Rule. This is a brief description of what it was. I would argue that the Scots at the moment, pre-referendum, have more independence than Home Rule had. It wasn't going to completely tear up our relationship with Britain. First thing was the Crown was still going to be there. The RIC was still going to be the police force. There was going to be no local control over it. The British Army, foreign policy, position of the Crown, pensions, land purchase, taxation, customs, post office, all things, even powers county councils have today, they don't have. And what Home Rule was going to do was going to set up a parliament in Dublin, and it would have a House of Lords in Dublin as well. But in Westminster, the number of Irish MPs would actually be reduced from 102 down to 42. So there would actually be less Irish power overall. But this measure of independence terrified the Unionists, not just in the north, but in the south as well. And a lot of Southern Irish society at that time, as I said, was Unionist, nationalist. Every town practically would have had an Orange Hall and would have had a Hibernian Hall, and the Hibernians would be linked with the nationalists.
Was not purely because Home Rule was oversold to both sides. In other words, it was oversold to the nationalist public.
Yeah,
and to the Unionist public, ironically, they both thought it was more than the small print actually
From the
said,
Unionist point of view, it was Home Rule is Rome Rule. This is a papist conspiracy. This is going to deny us all our rights. And something that helped feed into that actually was the Catholic Church's Ne Temere decree, which said if you've gotten married, Catholic and Protestant mixed marriage, all the kids have to be brought up Catholic. And that really freaked out Protestant loyalist Unionists. And this was being played up that there's no way, if we go in under a Dublin Parliament, we're finished, our economy will be destroyed, will be ruined. And from the nationalist point of view, it's being played up. I mean, we talk about, there's this idea that the home rulers and nationalists are pacifists. They're well in favour of violence and using violent rhetoric when it suits their purposes. And they're saying, as soon as we get our own parliament, we'll be completely independent, more independent than Grattan's parliament, which is not true. And the first thing we do is, you're hungry for land, we'll sort that situation out, everything will be perfect.
One thing just puzzles me about this situation is, though, if the Home Rule Party is dominant in terms of the parliamentary politics, and if these members of Parliament are being returned unopposed, where is the politics? Or is there any politics at high level?
I suggest, I kind of argued this in my book, that to me, Redmond was building a one-party state.
Yeah.
And the ancient order of Hibernians was operating like the Orange Order. What I studied in Cork, they were issuing instructions to judges to rule in certain cases. They were issuing the whip to public officials, a secret society. That's really dangerous. A fraternal order based on Catholicism and Irish nationalism, which nobody has, which is completely impervious, was issuing instructions to public officials, including judges. And what was happening with the Irish Party was they really didn't want opposition. They didn't accept opposition, probably because they were so scarred by the Parnell split. Yeah. But I would suggest that I'm not totally convinced how democratic they were, because that's also kind of the Cork thing going on, because there you had two parties totally at war. You had probably the one part of Ireland where there was opposition to Redmond's party, and man, they went at each other with hammer and tongs, and people being attacked constantly. The elections were hugely violent. People going into meeting halls, smashing each other up. So there wasn't very much kind of understanding and patience for political opposition and contestation at kind of a local level.
But John, just an observation here, right? That would seem to run counter to the view that post-Parnell split, the Home Rule Party is a kind of a hollowed-out shell, just waiting to be toppled, by a rising Sinn party. You don't buy that.
I don't.
People
you're saying it's still a vigorous organisation.
People didn't really get to vote in elections because these guys had it at a stranglehold. Quite often it's, the party decides who the candidate is and no other candidates put up against them. You go to a Home Rule party and you heckle someone on some taxation thing or something you're not happy about, and the Hibernians will arrive in as bully boys and beat you, and that's
but
it.
These are constitutional nationalists.
Supposedly.
Well, and keep in mind too, women couldn't vote, and about 2/3 of men couldn't vote. Yeah. Only ratepayers were voting. So it's the democracy is very, it's a very limited form of democracy as well.
So there was a big democratic deficit there, and this really is where the GAA came in. We're a very parish-based society, and in order to have power in any parish, really you had to be old and have authority that way, or you had to have money and have authority that way, and very few people had big jobs. But now, if you were the sporting hero of your local parish or your local team, suddenly you were a man in your early 20s who could command respect. And these were young men full of the red blood of freedom was flowing in their veins, and they couldn't be controlled. The home rulers and the Hibernians could not control these men. So throughout Kerry, you had men like Austin Stack, famous footballer, Dick Fitzgerald, famous footballer, and if you go through a lot of the other clubs, the people who were coming to the fore in these parishes and that were actually the sportsmen rather than anything else. So,
well, see, Tim, you've anticipated my question, because what I was going to ask was who were the people dissenting of this nascent one-party state that John has described. So you're suggesting that the GAA became the
springboard, really,
springboard for people an outlet for those who were excluded from this charm circle of Hibernians.
You had people like, we'd say Austin Stack. He was a solicitor's clerk. He wasn't even a solicitor, so he was a solicitor's clerk, although that was a distinct profession at the time. Or Dick Fitzgerald in Killarney, he was an egg salesman. These were people without sport certainly would not be prominent in their communities, but suddenly because of their prowess on the Gaelic football field, these were men that could be listened to, and they had something that struck a chord with other men of their age, and these were the men of action.
I mean, do you go along with that, Richard?
To a certain extent, not totally. I mean, obviously, and we'll look at this when we look at the volunteers. When the volunteers are formed, it's more often than not the local sportsman, even though he has no military background, or he has no command of men in that sense. I mean, they go to him. Yes, I'd take the point that the GAA, in an Irish sense, it is maybe one of the more democratic models that is out there in the 1880s and 1890s. And by being involved in the GAA, a lot of officials, were trained into how you operate.
You're suggesting this was a school of democracy
It
denied
was, there were two certain things. And of course, what you
organizing.
get then in 1898 is, of course, the Local Government Act. So you've got your county council, city council.
Well,
And that trained a lot of people, but
one thing I found actually just looking through, I mean, the RIC, the Royal Irish Constabulary, or the Eyes and Ears of Britain at the time, and they're filing these monthly reports, and we talked about women there in the vote. The suffragettes get one mention, meeting in Killarney passed off peacefully. Na Fianna Éireann is the only openly Republican organisation there at the time, the Nationalist Boy Scout movement set up by Countess Markovich. Its first branch in Kerry actually is here in Listowel. There's occasional labour groups like the Labour League or Tenants Association or Evicted Tenants Association spring up. Sinn Féin, the party we associate with republicanism, or at least separatism, wasn't Republican at the time, is not mentioned once in RIC reports. What is mentioned time and time again is the GAA. And what comes up, for example, in April 1912, the GAA is reported as having a considerable difference of opinion between the AOH, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, you can read for that the Home Rule Party, and the GAA at meetings held in Tralee on the merits of the Government of Ireland Bill. That's the Home Rule Bill. So who is the opposition? It's the GAA, and nationalists or Republicans using the GAA as a springboard for their own, their drive for independence.
I'll also just throw in, so we don't omit the Gaelic League. And Kerry has a really a unique role in the Gaelic League in that Kerry people speak pretty much the best Irish in the country. So people are coming down here constantly from Dublin to prove they're Irish. So Pierce, all the leaders of separatist Ireland are coming to Kerry. So there's constant back and forth. So Kerry basically is like it's basically plugged into the main artery of republicanism and separatism. And you see, that's also one of the reasons you have people like Thomas Ashe and
who radicalised the Gaelic League? It is Thomas Ashe. It is the O'Reilly.
And they have special, and they have in turn have special status within separatist Ireland because they speak beautiful Irish. So that's the language it's playing in here.
The other thing is the Irish language is drawing, as the British, as the RIC, their police force see it, troublemakers to the area. Like the two big people who emerge or two or three of the big people who emerge in the volunteers had come to Kerry to learn Irish, like Ernest Blythe and Desmond Fitzgerald, Gareth Fitzgerald's father.
But even within the county, say in Listowel here, one of the big Republicans during the Black and Tan War was Tomás O'Donoghue, who was from Renard near Casement, and he had come to the area as a Gaelic League teacher. Liam Scully, who was killed in Kilmallock during the Black and Tan War, he was a Gaelic League teacher up in Ballylongford. So not alone had you people from outside, but you had people from other areas of the county coming. Say Tomás O'Donoghue from Casement, he would have had a kind of a Fenian, maybe not quite background, but had grown up in a Fenian environment after the outbreak of.
And they learned how to organize both in the GAA and the Gaelic League. Yeah. They learned how to run meetings. They learned how to publicize. They learned how to teach, to instruct.
And they're the same people.
And they're the same people.
Exactly the overlap.
Can I just come in here, just again, as an outside observation? There's certain contradictions here, seems to me, because on the one hand, Padraig has said that little or no mention of Sinn Féin, right?
Yeah.
So it strikes me there is no political opposition. There is opposition by proxy through the GAA or whatever. Now, the thing is it true to say, though, that if you take, say, both the GAA and the emergence of local government from 1898 onwards, that wider circles of people are being co-opted into, what we would call conventional politics, albeit local conventional politics. So does this have a calming effect on the picture of moonlighters, etc., of lawlessness that you painted earlier? So, in other words, is Kerry becoming, I hesitate to use the word civilized, right, by the early 20th century?
Wait a second.
As the authorities would see it, I hasten to add. Discuss.
The Wyndham Act has already come through, and so land is already. So most of the land.
And their demands have been met then, right?
Yes.
So I make the point seriously that it is potentially becoming a more conservative place in that many of these dissenting elements are having their issues addressed.
But they're very active, and the people that are in the kind of the political establishment at the time, see everything. Home rule is coming. This is grand. It's all going to be sorted out. Yeah, the unionists have said they're going to stand against it, but that's not going to happen. And the crisis around home rule and unionist opposition to it, unionists set up the UVF. I mean, the guys in the IRB, I think it was Bulmer Hobson, said this was brilliant. They had brought the gun into politics. They had opened a door that couldn't be closed. Carsonism had given us the chance.
Applauded.
Yeah, and I mean, what happens when this home rule crisis springs up? The unionists say we'll fight against this. The nationalists say we'll fight against it. And who is instructive? Who's key in setting up the Irish Volunteers? It is again Republicans in the background who've been working away underground. And suddenly this huge movement of young men, and primarily it was men coming along, didn't come along until a short time later, but spring up and they're demanding a political change. And the Nationalist Party freak. We're not in control of this. We have to get control of it quickly.
No, but Padraig, I just need to come in there on that though. You're saying you're talking about people like the Bulmer Hobsons, etc., who are committed, Republicans, some IRB people as well. However, that is not, it seems to me, what is motivating the rank and file people who are joining the volunteers. They're joining the volunteers not because they're Republicans, but to ensure that home rule is actually implemented.
They are, but those who are often in key positions are part of the secret conspiracy we've been talking about, the Fenianism, that tradition bubbling along.
Yeah, but if it's secret, who's going to know about it? No, I mean, it's the problem.
Yeah, but if you're in a powerful position,
most of the officers, and most of the committees that set up the volunteers come from the separatist Ireland. Yeah. And even though when the actual split happens over participation in the war, and most people fall away from the Irish Volunteers retain about 15,000, but they retain the leadership, the core, and they have a skeleton group.
The IRA did the same as Civil War.
Exactly.
No, I tell you what, can you just pause on the volunteers, which I want to come back to, because that's the main meat of the discussion here tonight. Just quickly, on the question of dissenters, right, what about class struggle in Kerry? Because, of course, later, maybe I'm looking at this retrospectively, Kerry has always had a strong Labour tradition, shading into, Labour/Republican, right? Yeah. Where does that come from? It must have come from somewhere.
The Labour tradition is relatively new, really. I suppose it was a fairly classless society. And just going back there again, the land wars showed people that violence actually works, that you can actually take on the establishment. And by the mid-1890s, the landlord class, which were the immediate tyranny, they were gone. And the Moonlighters had played a huge part in this.
So rural class war is finished.
It's finished, yeah. There was and now
the landlords are gone.
The landlords are gone,
right.
yeah.
But I think what's unique about Labour in Ireland is how much it's able to appeal to an agricultural background. I mean, I don't think in any other country. Yes, I mean in areas like Dublin, of course, it's an urban. But when you look at Kerry. Areas like Kerry, there is a Labour movement because somehow it's able to channel the frustrations.
Quite often.
Are you suggesting, Tim, that that's a later development?
Yeah, it is. I think in 1944, the Fianna Fáil government executed Charlie Kearns, and so you had a lot of former Fianna Fáil voters who could not stomach voting for De Valera after he'd executed a Republican, and they drifted into voting for a footballer who consolidated the vote.
Long tradition of that sort of thing around in these parts. This is long tradition of that sort of thing in these parts.
There is a kernel there, and again, sometimes it's outsiders coming down. We talked about people coming down to learn Irish. Like the Transport and General Workers Union by 1911 is organised. There's a great Southern and Western Railway strike for better wages, and it basically it's described as a great loss to tourism. The British Army are down protecting Tralee railway station. The Royal Engineers
railways here were really radical.
The Royal Engineers are protecting what's called scab labour, working on the trains. There's the odd eviction and things like that, but really this is confined to the Tralee. And you get guys like William Partridge, who's a Labour councillor in Dublin, leading member of the Irish Citizen Army, comes down and starts organising, gets I think a shoe factory in Tralee to go on strike for I think some terms and conditions related to Patrick's Day and their pay on a holiday. And actually when he's court-martialed and sentenced to death in 1916, they add as a footnote to the bottom, not only is he a Fenian, he's actually a bit of a red organiser, so shoot him for that as well. And James Connolly, actually, who we obviously is the big national Labour figure, he visits the Tralee Trades and Labour Council in 1915. So it's mainly in Tralee in the larger areas, but it is starting to take off.
But I think it's maybe outside the remit of this discussion, it seems to me, from what Tim is well, thank God for that. We can move on to the next topic, or not that we've already touched on it, but I want to just come back to the volunteers. Right? Volunteers are founded towards the end of 1913. How much of an impact do they make,
In
Tim?
November, this, from a personal point of view, my grandfather went to his Gaelic League class in Killarney, as he did kind of every Thursday night, and the class was interrupted by the teacher in the class saying he'd been in Dublin the week before, and guess what? And the volunteers were set up, and he said, well, why not we set up volunteers? And they were set up in Killarney that night, and that was the first, within a week of them being set up in Dublin, there was a volunteer company set up in Killarney, then shortly within a week in Tralee, and then it spread like a virus throughout the county.
It didn't, I mean, there was still only 1,000 volunteers in Kerry by April 1914, and in a national sense, you're talking about
Well,
But the following-
25,000.
We have
But
the
what
Irish-
happens is, with the Curragh Mutiny, with the Larne landing, and of course with what happens in Bachelor's Walk, that's the explosion. What you get,
of course, yeah,
what you get between May and August
Yeah.
is
Well, also Redmond approves
Yes, and
Irish
Redmond,
Party
of
people
course,
to
as well.
join in. Yeah.
So he gets Redmond's blessing, right?
Yeah.
Now, I just want to tease this out because there seems to be a contradiction here, right? You seem to be saying that the volunteers were strong from the get-go, right? I get the impression from what Richard is saying and what John is saying that not really. That
No, they were strong.
They were strong, but I mean,
enlistment
the real
was slow
explosion-
enough
there was
in the early stages.
The companies were set up like a virus throughout the county. This was an idea waiting to happen.
Right.
As it turned out, when Redmond took his volunteers, you just had the committed left. We'll call it the Republican Party volunteers were just what was left. But it did set up very, very quickly. 1,000 volunteers is maybe 1 in 40 adult males in the county at the time.
But I mean, it
which
grows
is-
to about 4,000 by the
Okay,
end of
let's look at this different angle.
And it grows during that crucial period between May and August.
I'm trying to get a sense, you see, maybe comparatively, right? In other words, if you say to me 1,000 volt, that means little or nothing to me, I have to say, right? Unless I compare it with something else. So, Padraig, how does it compare with the Banner County across the water?
In County Clare, you would have, by that time, 1,500, 2,000 volunteers, which is what you're reaching to here in Kerry. The thing, it's going to depend. Quite often, the first guys to move in this, as we said, are not the nationalists, the Fenians, so it's going to depend who's stronger, and certainly in that sense, it gets going quicker in Kerry, but then when it does get going in Clare, it kind of does overtake it. But if you're talking about a movement that's just been established brand new in November 1913, and by April of 1914, it had 1,000. And then people at first don't take it seriously. The lads there with their wooden guns, they're not serious. But when volunteers start to arm, when the Curragh Mutiny happens and things gather pace, as you said, Richard, suddenly it doubles overnight. Of the figures here from the RIC, they estimated 1,000 in April 1914. By May of 1914, 1,745, 13 branches of the Irish Volunteers in the county
And that
with
grows
that
to 48
membership.
then by the end of the year.
And they say classes of small farmers, shop assistants, labourers are joining up the force. Movement is supported by all sections of nationalists. The force is supported by the Catholic clergy, and that's key. And even British Army reservists are doing the actual instructing.
And you can understand why. I mean, if you're fed on a diet of Home Rule for 20 years, and all of a sudden you have Edward Carson in the north with his band of men, and they're going, no, we're going to split Ireland, and it's not going to be this united Ireland. We're going to get this piecemeal bit of independence, and it's only going to be for 26 counties. Next thing what happens is they're serious because they get the Larne. They get the gun running in Larne, and everyone's going, okay, now these are a really serious armed force. You've got the situation which is the biggest military political crisis in British history.
Can I just interject here? Are we calling it a mutiny or an incident?
Well, I suppose
I call him.
An incident.
But I tell you, so I might just chip in here. I was at a very interesting all-day conference in the Curragh actually last week, and it was a mixture of historians and legal people, both British and Irish. And the very interesting thing is the consensus amongst the historians was there wasn't a mutiny, and the consensus amongst the legal people, including prominent British guys on the panel, was there was a mutiny. That's interesting now for you, but I'm not sure what that actually means. Right?
But I mean, like I said, you've got a parliamentary force that has now armed and is saying and has plans to set up a provisional government if Home Rule goes. And you would think to most nationalists, okay, well, surely the British government are going to step in. And now they see that, hold on, their strong hand, the army, is now balking over the orders that they would have to go in and actually impose Home Rule. So you could see all of a sudden nationalists are going, well, hold on a second, are we going to have what we've been struggling for a generation hijacked by Edward Carson.
It makes constitutional nationalism a joke.
Yeah.
It makes the whole idea the whole time is, you play these games in the House of Commons, you elect these people, you play the parliamentary games. That's the way we do this. And you finally, by some complete, beautiful 1910 general election, the Irish have the balance of power, everything's great, it's going to happen, and then guess what happens? The Ulster Unionists form their own army, refuse to do it. The British Army refuses to act against them. They threaten a civil war. It makes the whole thing a joke, and it totally validates physical force republicanism.
Okay, John, now, if I get in there, it may make it a joke, but there is no obvious route for people to express that dissatisfaction because there's no other show in town at the parliamentary political level. So,
Well, what
where
happens?
does that frustration go?
What happens is people start joining the volunteers, and Redmond is dismissive of it, and the Irish Party, the Irish Parliamentary Party adherents don't join. But the movement keeps getting stronger and stronger and stronger, and so ultimately he has to get in. And once he does that, he's not in total control anymore. And as we said, the whole thing with the Irish Party was being in total control, and it's just getting out of control. And that's why people are starting to expect there's going to be a civil war, because both sides. The same is true with Edward Carson. He set up the UVF. He wasn't thinking they were going to have to fight, but that movement radicalized, and it just got out of his control. He couldn't control it anymore.
That's it, John. I mean, the establishment in Britain, the parliamentary political establishment, they can't control with this. The Liberal Party is struggling, Ascot is struggling, like you said, John Redmond. This is something completely beyond what they're capable, what they're used to understanding. They've never seen anything like this in their political lives.
There still seems to be a contradiction to me, though, if I may be so bold, that it seems to me, though, it's not clear what this expanding volunteers actually represents. In other words, you could argue that it's not particularly radical, that it's a fairly conservative thing. In other words, that they see the Ulster volunteers as the radicals, if you like, those who want to overturn the status quo.
Yeah. Well, as they say, as the RSC say, you've every class of nationalist in there. I mean, you've people from left and right-wing ideologies and everything. The idea is, look, this has been on the cards for 40 years. We want home rule, we want independence. Some people were happy with that. Some people wanted to move beyond it.
No, but I mean, the thing is, these guys are in alliance with the then government in London. Supposedly, do you know what I mean? Their allies are the Liberals in government.
Yeah,
they're not totally at a remove. The Unionists are the ones out on a limb.
But we still have that.
But then the Conservatives are backing the Unionists in Parliament.
Yeah.
So they have their own. I mean, it's a difficult one to understand, I suppose. I mean, you can't go to every single member and what's their motivation. I would say it is just, look, if the Unionists are arming, we've got to arm. And you could see that with the reception of the Hope gun running. You know, there's elation, and they talk about it for years to come. It's the greatest, single... I mean, some volunteers describe it as the greatest day of their lives, that they got the weapons. And now they're no longer men with hurleys or men with sticks. Now they're actually... They have a rifle. They're serious now, just like the Ulster Volunteers are. They're a serious force.
Right, let's move on, right, because of course the Home Rule crisis, ironically, is put on the back burner by the outbreak of the First World War. What happens in Kerry in relation to the First World War, Tim, in terms of either recruitment or attitudes to the war? I mean, is it the same as everywhere else, where there's a flush of enthusiasm in the early days? What's the picture?
I suppose there's a flush of enthusiasm. The British Army were a local force, really. I mean, most of them were the Royal Munster Fusiliers, so they weren't really regarded as an army of occupation. The enemy were the RIC, really. One of probably the most prominent politician here at the time was Thomas O'Donnell. O'Donnell was from West Kerry originally and was very active in getting the land for the people, and he started off very radical, but as time went on he became less and less radical and really became an establishment figure, and he was the leading recruiter. O'Donnell had a lot of political clout and brought a lot of money and a lot of industry and buildings to the county and that. So with O'Donnell's influence, you did have quite a significant amount of recruiting, especially in his areas in the county where he was.
I think, as Alan Drum has and he's a very good book of his, and Kerry and the Munster Volunteers, he has estimated there's about 674 Kerrymen die on active service in World War I. So from that, he's extrapolated it's about 2,000 Kerrymen probably fought. And out of that, there's claims that about 1,200 are from Tralee, and the majority of the rest are Killarney and Listowel. It's very much the urban centres. Right. And again, that's what Padraig was going back to. what other economic
Cynics would say
opportunities
because the farmers are too busy making
Yes,
money
and I mean,
from the booming wartime economy.
It's very interesting what happens in Kerry because it's a boom for the agricultural. So the rural farmers, especially in North Kerry, are doing great, but there's huge deprivation.
So they're staying at home making money. I mean,
yeah.
you know,
but what is there in Tralee and Killarney? The tourism industry closer than Killarney. In Tralee, fuel prices go up. Crucially, the price of a barrel of porter goes from £1 to £3 over 4 years. There's a huge increase in price of bread and so on. Unemployment in the urban areas. What are young men meant to do?
And that's the key thing, because initially there's this big burst, if you look at the figures, 1914, war breaks out, it'll be great, swift victory, we'll all be home by Christmas. And this huge amount of people join. Now, they're not all joining because of Redmond's promises over Home Rule. First thing you got to look at is, if you had served in the British Army before and you come out, anything up to 7 years later, you were a reservist. You had to go back in time of war. That's part of your contract, so they went in. You've got to look at the Unionists, Southern Unionists at the time. They wanted to serve for king and country. But if you look at the recruitment figures, we take 1915, and really after 1915 it drops off completely. The national recruitment figures from 1915 are that 51,000 Irish men enlist. There's no conscription. These guys are volunteering to go into the British Army. 11,000 of those are associated with the National Volunteers. 8,000 are associated with the UVF. And where are the other 32,000 odd from? They're from the poor. Or if they're not from the poor, and again, Alan Drummond, I think you'd agree with me, Richard, on this, it may not be military conscription, but it's economic, it's hunger conscription that's driving them in there.
That is the crucial point, economic conscription.
The other thing that's huge time as well is propaganda. Today we have our Wi-Fi and we have Facebook and we have a million different news channels we can look at. Back then they had newspapers, they were censored in time of war, and they were full of stories about Belgian atrocities. Whole convent loads of nuns being raped, the hands and feet and breasts being cut off.
Those atrocities,
women and
many
children.
of those atrocities did occur now.
Yes, but there is not one single incident, and there was a British commission into this after the war. Not one single incident where the breasts or the hands or the feet have been cut off a Belgian woman by German soldiers. And a classic one is the crucified Canadian. After the truce in the First World War at Christmas, when the soldiers all come out of their trenches and play football, it's very hard to get them to go back killing each other after that. So British propaganda or Allied propaganda invents this brilliant story about a Canadian soldier who is picked up by the Germans and crucified against the barn door with bayonets. Fantastic propaganda, but completely untrue, and it's been proven as such. And Home Rule recruiters for the British Army were feeding into this sort of stuff. They were talking about this, the Germans had been captured and they had a map and it showed the farm and every Kerry in detail on it, and the Germans were going to come and take your farms. And this map would have to be huge, it'd have to be the size of Croke Park. But the other thing is, the famous one that I like is, there was from Cork, there was a guy who won a VC, O'Leary, and he took out a German machine gun nest, and they wanted him to go on a recruiting tour. He wasn't available. They put his father up, and at the first recruiting night he said, "It's your job to go out and join the British Army, because if the Germans come here they'll treat us even worse than the English do." End of recruiting tour.
But on that point, Padraig, of course, obviously by 1905, when Kerry won their first All-Ireland, and that first great period, Kerry has established itself as the strongest football county in Ireland. You know, they are the great football county. And of course, what recruiters do, like Lawrence Roach, who's a captain of the Munster Fusiliers from Limerick, is involved in the Limerick GA. He comes on a recruiting tour for the Munster Volunteers in Kerry in 1915. And what do? They play up to the GA. Just like in England, when they're trying to recruit, they play up to rugby and soccer, play up to the GA. So what they very famously, in June 1915, he's at a recruitment meeting in Tralee, and he goes, you know, I hope the war cry up Kerry will be heard in the trenches when they're defeated. I hope the war cry up Kerry will be heard when we make the last attack on the Germans' gold. So they're using the sporting motif.
But the point is,
they're tying into the GA
recruitment
stronghold.
Is actually exceptionally poor in Kerry. As I said, there's that initial burst going in, just
exactly.
to be clear. And I mean, Lord Kitchener, the guy who was on the posters, who was actually from Listowel, your country needs you, expressed his disappointment at how poor recruitment was in Kerry. The National Volunteers, Redmond's crowd, after the split, organised this huge recruiting campaign. How many recruits do they bring in? According to the RIC, it's just 4. There's talks of these recruiting meetings all over the country, or the county. But very few people are actually joining.
That just anticipates. Sorry, just John, for a second. One of the questions I want to ask: how does Kerry cleave on the National Volunteers, Irish Volunteers? I mean, the Irish Volunteers are 10% only.
Nationalist volunteers all over the country disintegrate, not just Kerry, but in other areas as well. Because people think, if I turn up for for parade, there's going to be a British recruiting sergeant there, and he's going to be taking number or names for when.
But
definitely
before
it goes,
that, hang on, Padraig. No, I have a different question I'm asking. I'm talking in the early stages when Redmond made his call, right, which led to 90% of the Irish volunteers nationally. Heading off to the trenches, right? What way does Kerry go?
Kerry goes Irish Volunteers. There's 48 branches.
So that books the trend.
Yeah, there's 48 branches. Nationally, about 25%. Nationally, like you said before, John, about 15,000 out of 180,000 go with McNeil, the Irish Volunteers. But in Kerry, out of the 48 branches, over 25% go. And very quickly, the National Volunteers disintegrate completely.
And I just say just one more thing about Kerry. We forget Gallipoli. Gallipoli was this huge disaster for Irish troops. Mm-hmm. The Munster Fusiliers got slaughtered in Gallipoli. That's a Kerry regiment. Yeah. So Kerry took really heavy casualties in Gallipoli a year before the Battle of the Somme. Yeah. And we forget that's Padraig Óg was saying that, the Gallipoli was Dublin's Somme, and because the Dubs took really massive casualties here. So we totally forget that the Irish troops actually took really heavy casualties earlier than a lot of these other divisions did.
In one street in Tralee, in the Mitchell's Crescent area, what the people that live there, they lived in the lanes in Tralee before that, and of 22 of them that went to Gallipoli, one came back. Yeah. On top of that, I suppose the Irish Volunteer, National Volunteer split resembled the Parnell split. We kind of did buck the trend a little bit here, but where the companies did split, it was the more committed leadership stayed with the Republic. So it was actually a benefit to the revolutionary movement that split occurred because the hardcore were left and the committed were left, so that those planning and plotting on revolution.
From what you're saying, it was a larger hardcore.
Oh yes,
in this part of the country.
Yes, definitely.
Now, just for anybody who hasn't been at History Ireland Head School, I can see everyone's looking far too relaxed. Which I don't like, because we do encourage audience participation here. So I'd just like to open up the floor. I was going to give you a bit of time to draw a breath, but you're in straight away. So and please use the radio mic so we can hear you. And maybe if you just let us know who you are, maybe as well.
Thanks very much. Eamon Mulvihill is my name. I'm from County Meath, where Parnell was MP for Meath. And I worked all my life in Kildare town beside Curragh, and all my people are from near Listowel. So that's who I am. I just want to say just three little things, and I won't be long. Parnell, it seemed to me from what you say, a lot of movements used other movements. And I know in Meath, Parnell said he was very good at speaking in double negatives and treble negatives. And he said he'd never have taken off his coat and gone to work for the Land League if he didn't think it wouldn't lead to Home Rule. Even the monument in Parnell Square, he said, let no man set a boundary to the march of a nation, because no man has a right to say to his country, thus far shalt thou go and no further. So he's three no's in that. So maybe Jimmy could learn something there. But could I just say, the second thing I'd like to say, during my time in Kildare town, there was a strong belief that when Kildare won the Sam Maguire in 1927, that a lot of their skills were honed by playing the Kerry Republicans in the Curragh camp. And the Kildare people tended to say that the Kerry team of the late 20s, which I think won 3 All-Irelands in a row, four, that team, well, I don't know how many of them, but a lot of them learned their football in the Curragh, in Kildare. You mentioned you were in the Curragh there recently. And finally, I'd just like to make the point that my grandmother, I suppose all my grandparents are from near Listowel, but my grandmother was the youngest of 13, and her eldest brother died in the last month of World War I, and he's buried in northern France. He's named in the headstone in Listowel here, 29 years of age. The war isn't mentioned, but he died in the American Army, not in the British Army. I was just going to say, Minister Deenahan, just to say it while he's here, that there's a huge chance for us in the next 4 years to maybe involve the Kerry men who died in the American Army in World War I. And John might have an idea. I don't know how many Kerry...
I just say that Jerry White's great book, Cork's Great Sacrifice, which named all the Cork dead, what they found and what that project did was it traced everybody went to graveyards. They found about 20% of the Cork War dead didn't die in the British Army. They died in the Commonwealth Army. They died in Australia. They died in Canada. They died in British regiments. Or let's put it this way: they didn't necessarily, not a big chunk of the Irish casualties did not die in Irish regiments. Mm-hmm. A lot of people had emigrated, and a lot of those immigrants got caught up in the war. And so a lot of them died in the American Army, a lot of them died in the Australian Army, a lot of them died in the Canadian Army, and a lot of them died in Liverpool regiments, Glasgow regiments, and that's what we have to count. We have to actually make a concerted effort to count those people, I think.
Yeah, I'd love if that could be done. And could I just say, last thing I want to say is, when I was transported to Kerry as a child, when I was 8 and 9 for the summers to keep a granny company, she used to open the drawer in the parlour and take out the picture of her oldest brother who died, as she'd say, in the Great War. And it was that eldest brother who, as I said, was in northern France. So it'll internationalise the whole thing and maybe help the Anglo-Irish relations to realise there's a bigger picture.
Yeah.
That's all I meant.
Yeah. Jim, do you want to get in there? Just if you give him the microphone there. Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
Justine, actually, this week we're setting up a monument to, we're putting in the base. It's an all-Ireland initiative where the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Teresa de Villiers, has come down, and we're doing it jointly for all Irish people who died in the First World War. And I think just the panel would agree with me, most of the people who went to fight in the First World War were fighting for Ireland. So they fought for Ireland in the World War, and they came back then and fought for Ireland in the War of Independence as well. So they were driven with the ideal that if they won the First World War, that it would get home rule for Ireland. Yeah. And that was really, I know that kind of simplifies it a little bit, but that's what drove so many of them at that particular time. And also Tom Kettle, a man that's really, I think, he deserves more recognition. He was quite an interesting individual. But he went over looking for guns for the volunteers, and he saw the atrocities that the Germans were doing on the Belgians firsthand. And that's why he fought in the First World War. That's why he changed his mind. He was over to get guns, but he then fought in the World War, again because of what he saw over there at that particular time. But just on, and there are a number of people. There's a man up there, John Daly. He's buried here. He was shot in 1918. I see he's a gravestone up here in actually the local graveyard. So look, there's a huge connection, and I just feel that up until now people were a bit reluctant to even accept or recognise the fact that they had someone that died in the First World War or participated. I think we're mature enough as a nation now to recognise their contribution as well. I think it's important that we would do that. At the same time, recognising, of course, what the men of 1916 did too, but we're trying to do the timeline as much as possible.
Thank you, Minister. Now, anybody, just gentleman here at the back, yeah?
Yeah, I'd correct the Minister there. If I may, I'd say that within all families, they'll always remember their own dead. That's the most important to remember. Second thing I'd say, that man that mentioned about the American forces, that's very apt point. There was a Willie Moore from Patrick Street in Listowel that fought in the American Army in the First World War. Just 3 points that strike me. We have a very distinguished top table here today, and as we're involved in history, I think the most important thing for all of us is to learn the lessons from history, if any such lessons can be learned. And I'm an accountant myself, based in Kerry at the moment, and I have a very good interest in history. And we're talking about a timeline. And last year we had the 100th anniversary of the lockout in Dublin, which was a terrible time for the workers. And 100 years on, we have a job bridge scheme, which to me is the modern equivalent of the lockout. Next week we have the commemoration 100 years of Cumann Mon. It's very important to commemorate them. And 100 years on, maternity benefit for mothers and young families who are meant to be protected by society are taxed. And maternity benefit is taxed. It's disgraceful. And then this week, We have revelations about the Garda stations, and we won't go any further than that because we're at a cultural event, shall we say. But anyone reading accounts, contemporary accounts going back to, we'll say 1914, to bring us back to our timeline, would be very conscious of the eyes and ears of Dublin Castle. And I suppose the analogies, of those three analogies, three simple analogies, 100 years on, maybe I could ask the panel, have we moved on? Have we learned from history at all? Thank you.
Sorry, I better just point out that the proceedings here tonight are being recorded, number one, and they're also being tweeted live, and just to make a public declaration on that.
Yeah, I don't represent any political party or anything.
No, that's okay. No, it's fine. No, but yeah, this gentleman here. Yeah.
Thanks, Cara. McElligott is my name. My grandfather came from Causeway. He was District Inspector of the Sinn Féin Police here in North Kerry. It was 1919. And actually, he, according to the GA book, he brought hurling to Listowel from the Kerry head side. Now, Tim in particular, when he went out and spoke to a lot of those people that survived, unfortunately, we never got to see what was in his head. But I'm moving away from introducing myself to, in the morning, if Minister Deanan was able to say that LNG would be starting and there'd be jobs for people in North Kerry, my God, would there be hope? And I'm just reflecting, we're only after publishing a book called The North Kerry Line. It was the railway linking Limerick down to Tralee. And I know Minister Deanan launched it, and he picked out very significant points in it, insofar as that the landlords, they put a lot of money into that particular line. They had great hopes that it would be the transatlantic base from Tarbert, Fines, etc. like that. And there was a big battle really between the east and the west coast, and we were hoping that North Kerry would be the place. So the other thing is the excitement of the railway coming in 1880. Then we had the monorail from Listowel to Ballybunnon and the Employment Act created, 1888 to 1924, 36 years. And the influx of tourists was enormous. They came from all over the country. Now, it is significant when you look at the actual ballot papers in the local elections, which I have. They were divided between Sinn Féin and the Labour Party, as such, so politics was divided there from that particular point. But I'm just contrasting then in the background, and Jimmy here was very much involved in the republishing of the book there. There's a photograph of Bertie Behe there. Up on the wall, it was depicting the Anglo-Irish period and the landlords in the period. I mean, even you spoke about the Kitchener and the settling between Colbehe and Kilflin. Likewise, Arthur Vickers, after the stealing of the Irish crown jewels, settled out in Kilmorna House and the O'Mahony's. So I'd say, that there was actually a great degree of future and hope in North Kerry in that period, contrary to what we might think. Think about it, that the first vice transmission across the Atlantic was from Ballybunnon. Marconi saw fit to actually set up a base in Ballybunnon. So all this excitement was going on. Secondary school education, the classics for St. Michael's College here in Listowel. And I suppose really, your slogan there, a nation that forgets its past can function no better than the individual with amnesia. And it is our whole desire here, those of us who are involved in the Great Southern Trail, and I know you're publishing, you're doing great work, but our aim would be to link through the trail, using the old railway line, that villages and towns along the way, that tourists would stop off and talk to the people. And we really believe that, there's great potential, and do you think there is great potential in getting tourists and people, Americans and otherwise, to travel along and stop and to talk and give them time as such with the local history. I think, you know, what I have been saying is that we have a wealth of stuff, and I'm trying to contrast what you have been speaking all along with the hope that the railway gave, Marconi, and they saw all this happening right up to 1924.
Thank you. Yeah, this gentleman here. I think we'll let the audience.
My name is Jerry Flynn. I haven't any long speech. I wanted to ask about the infiltration of the GA at the time by a lot of British spies was one thing. And the other thing was, first of all, did you think it had a big effect on the volunteers eventually, because it didn't seem to have. The second thing was, you mentioned there that in the 1890s the landlords were finished, I think somebody said. Do you think the Incumbent Estates Act had a lot to do with that, in that a lot of Irish had returned from Africa and places and bought up a lot of the land, and certainly it was prosperous in the beginning of the First World War, selling a lot of meat and cattle and so on. Just those two questions, if we could comment.
I suppose with regard to the infiltration, I suppose the colonial authorities would always try to demoralise the reason people by saying, we know what you're up to, we have spies in all your ranks. But in fact, the outbreak in 1916 caught the British by surprise. Certainly take for example the GA, many of the prominent figures later during the Black and Tan War were prominent GA figures as well. I was just going down through them in my head. We'll say Austin Stack, prominent Kerry administrator and All-Ireland winner. His deputy, Paddy Cahill, also played for Kerry. In Listowel here, you had Paddy Landers, a blacksmith. He played for Kerry. In South Kerry, you had John Joe Rice. Again, he played hurling for Kerry. Humphrey Murphy, Kerry footballer, 1915. Dinny Daly down in, who was the second in command down in the Kerry Tree Brigade area down in Carsevine. Dinny Daly played football for London, the London Irish county team, where he also played with Michael Collins. So the GA infiltrated is probably the wrong word. These were committed nationalists, and they obviously took pride in playing the committed nationalist game, our own national games, rather than anything else. With regard to landlordism here, really, after the land wars, together with the Land Acts that came in, landlordism was actually was beaten here in this country. One of the big things that happened was Killarney House in the 1880s burned down. It was just an accidental fire, and Lord Kenmare, to impress his friends in Britain who were coming over to touristy Killarney, had to build a bigger house, and in which case then he raised the rents on his lands, and he was the biggest landowner in Kerry. And Sam Hussey, who was his rack renter, Hussey was Irish, of course, he starved his own people just so he could be the last out of them. Hussey was forced to leave Ireland when his house was dynamited in Edinburgh by the people of McElligott and Castleisland. So once Hussey left, really the power of the landlords was gone. So much so that in McElligott, during the Troubles, a meeting was held in the volunteers there, and they said, well, should we burn down Ballyseedy Castle, the home of the Blennerhassett family? And the consensus was, well, they really are a quiet people, they haven't done anything to us. It was all Sam Hussey. So in fact, the landlords had become really irrelevant by the time the Troubles kind of broke out.
It's interesting what you say about infiltrated. When you're I think you're asking about the GA specifically infiltrated. When the GA is formed, like any organisation, the British are, the RIC are very suspicious of it initially and see it very much as a political organisation. So much so that in Kerry, in the first 3 or 4 years, it was completely infiltrated by spies. Very famously, there was one by the codename of Emerald, who was being paid £10 a year for sending back information to the RIC, which is a very substantial amount of money.
Match reports?
Match reports. No, it wasn't. And you get all of these stories. And of course, the thing is, the GA is political, but it's a sporting organisation first and foremost. You know, yes, ever since the GA is founded in Kerry, or the county board is in 1887, it is dominated by IRB men. There's a debate, how much are they IRB men and how much are they sporting men? That just happen to be IRB men. But certainly the REC had infiltrated it. But I mean, the reports coming back are, okay, after a match is played, the likes of Maurice Minan, who's I would consider the godfather of the GA in Kerry, he's the man who starts the GA in Kerry in 1887.
all these reports of him coming in with his contemporaries, bringing in a young lad, piling him a drink after a match, spinning him around 3 times, bringing him to a blackened out room and asking him all sorts of questions. And if he spills the beans on anything he's been told while he was drinking, he's out and all this. You get all these crazy stories. A lot of the way I think it's spies trying to justify why they're getting paid, so they're making up stuff. But definitely at the start, the GA is infiltrated. But by the 1890s, because the GA has collapsed across Ireland, and because, the GA, in fact, it does collapse in Kerry between 1897 and 1900. It's debunked. There's no GA in Kerry. There's no administration. So by then it's seen as a lesser threat. So they keep an eye on it, but they don't infiltrate it as much. The spies and informers don't infiltrate it enough. But bear in mind, make no mistake, the IRB controlled the GA in Kerry from 1887 right up to the 1920s. Now, it's debatable how much, like I said, does that mean they want the GA to be a radical organisation? Or is it just, like you said, Padraig, these are men who go towards the Gaelic League. They're just naturally attracted to all of these organisations. How much do they put sporting considerations first?
And just keep in mind also with, just in terms of land, not all the land ownership, even though the big estates have been broken up, not everybody had land, and there was still a lot of land hunger. And what you see in 1918 is you see a national outbreak of agrarianism. Where it's cow versus plow, where it's people who want tillage land versus grazers. And you see that especially in the War of Independence and the Revolutionary period up at Connacht. And so there's less IRA activity against the Black and Tans, against Crown forces. There's a lot more agrarianism and people who are going in, taking land where they've been evicted from. And so things are manifesting, the revolutionary intensity is manifesting itself in different areas. And in places where the land hasn't transferred and there's a lot of land hunger, it breaks out, agrarianism breaks out.
And that happens in North Kerry. So much so that Austin Stack has to actually publish in local Kerry papers, take as a full-page ad to go, stop with the land agitation. We have a bigger enemy to defeat first, the British. Once the British are gone, we'll sort all this out. But they're the enemy. Stop shooting at each other, basically.
Now, I'll take one more from the floor because I just noticed that time is moving on here. Yeah.
I was interested there. I think it was Mr. McElligott, is it?
Richard. Yeah, McElligott. Richard.
Fine. You mentioned there in 1885 that there was martial law declared in Kerry. Have you any of the background to that?
Like I was stating, that because Kerry was the land agitation had gotten to such a high intensity that there was so many cases of not drive-by shootings, I suppose, but Horrifonian trap shootings, but maiming of animals outrageous. And so on, outrageous, of course, because there's so much of this that the RIC Dublin Castle had to set down a special under General Sir Henry Buller, that's it, exactly. He was put in charge of a special force of 300 RIC who was sent down here. Martial law was declared in Kerry to basically try and quench this agrarian violence.
I might say
Buller later became a hero of the Boer War, and he led the relief of Ladysmith. I think that was the place in South Africa. He marched a regiment of Irish soldiers in. On the first line of those Irish soldiers was a man called Robert Monteith, who came here to Banna Strand with Roger Casement and took command of the Irish Volunteers that Easter weekend.
Robert Monteith lived in my house in Dublin. Yes,
It all comes full circle.
I was sent, Angus Mitchell sent me a photocopy of an exclusion order served on the Defences of the Realm Act, and it said, Robert Monteith of 6 Palmerston Place, Dublin 7, which you notice is the editorial address of History Ireland magazine. That's where I live. Right? I'm going to get a plaque put up outside within the next year. Listen, I wanted by maybe just taking a little peek over the arbitrary cut-off date we put in here, which is 1916, right, which obviously transforms everything. Now, obviously, the planning for that was in a very tight, secret caucus. In this part of the world, did anybody see what was coming down the line in terms of either the rising? Because it seems to me from the picture you've created, which is very interesting. By the way, when I set this up, I naively assumed that Kerry was a very quiet backwater with nothing happening at all, and you've completely overturned my entire premise for this discussion, right? But that's the way these things go. So did people in this part of the world see this coming, or were they even intimately involved in the planning?
Certainly from the British side, the RIC had no idea this was coming. You read the report for March of 1916, the year beforehand, and they're basically, if they had a computer, they'd be copying and pasting what was there last month, how many volunteers are there, what are they up to. Yeah. They have no idea on the ground in Kerry, the British forces, that this is coming. The volunteers and those involved in Fenianism, those who were really active and committed and sworn into the IRB would have had an idea, and Tim and Richard probably know more about that.
How much of an idea though, Tim?
They knew there was something coming, but they didn't realise when it came that that was it.
Yeah,
Richard?
I mean, Austin Stack was obviously, like in October 1915, Padraig Pearse visits Austin Stack, makes him the brigadier of the Irish Volunteers in Kerry, and informs him that the rising is about to happen in the spring of 1916. He knows this is happening, so he actually makes preparations to secure arms and weapons, and he's the person that comes up with the idea. It's his plan that when the Ord comes in, how they're going to get the weapons
Yeah,
up.
but that was going to be my final question, right? Which is, why did they pick Kerry? The weapons were landed, but they were planning to land.
Well, they
why
were
Kerry?
always planning to land around the west of Ireland. There was talk of the Shannon Estuary. I think because of Austin Sachs and his position in Tralee and around the Tralee area, they decided that Tralee Bay would be the best route. It was always going to be on the west of Ireland. They thought, obviously, that would be the easiest way for a ship to...
So it's party geography.
Yeah,
the plan, part of it was the strength.
The railways.
Jim, you want to say something there? Yeah. Where's the microphone there so we can... Yeah.
In the military pensions archive, some of you may have noticed that there was an individual called Padraig Brennan. Actually, he was sent by the volunteers to Listowel to secure the guns from the Ord. This is in
Clareman.
You know, yeah. Clareman. And they were going to keep some of the guns here in Listowel and then transport the rest of the guns on the train, actually, to Limerick. So it was planned, and Listowel was in that whole plan to store the guns here for some time as a transshipment part of it. So it's in the military archive. You can check it up. Patrick Brennan. It's quite interesting.
Brennan?
Yeah, that's what I was just saying, that in the military pensions archive, actually, there's information that people didn't actually know before. So that's one point there to show like how involved really are in the plan. You know, Listowel was for the importation of the guns.
Could I say as well, Patrick Brennan, he's actually from my own home place in Meelick. He was the first Garda Commissioner of the Civic Guard, and he lost the job because he mutinied. Reason why he mutinied was because District Inspector Ernie, the man who had arrested Roger Casement, came into the force from the RIC over into the new Civic Guard, and he said, we're not serving associating with him. Rightly or wrongly, that could be a whole other hedge school, but that's an interesting connection to him. And the other thing I'd say is the reason why the guns came to Kerry, as we said, had this huge, strong, very Republican volunteer force. They were going to land them here and then ship them up to Clare, to Galway, where they're almost as strong.
Yeah. And Austin Stack is a big figure in Sinn Féin.
I am going to deliberately bring matters to a close here, because I want to leave you with a sense of anticipation for the next hedge school, which we will look at this in more detail, right? So you always have to leave them with a sense of anticipation. And the Minister teed up beautifully a plug for the next issue of History Ireland, which there is a series of short articles on the military pensions, which if you want to get a quick flavour of that, amazing, and it really is, and we're only getting the start of it, of course, you know, this is only the early stuff, that'll be in our next issue. So I just like to draw matters to a close. As I said, in some ways this discussion hasn't quite gone the way I anticipated, but that's the beauty of these things. The next hedge school, by the way, will be next week. The Ministers mentioned the conference on Common Man, and that will be wrapped up on Saturday evening with a hedge school, and that will take place in the National Museum in Collins Barracks. And then the next one after that, seeing as there's a Clareman on the panel, is the big one, of course, the millennium of Brian Boru and the Battle of Clontarf, and we're having two goes at that one. There's going to be one in the National Library. Well, let me get me dates here. 21st of May, and then as part of Féile Brian Boru in Killaloo on the 5th of July. And I'm hoping for a bit of weather for that weekend, and maybe I look forward to seeing you at one or other of these events. But if you want to check on other hedge schools, have a look on our website, historyireland.com, and it's all laid out there. So I'd like to thank all our speakers, Richard McElligott from just up the road, John Borgonovo from San Francisco via Cork, Tim Horgan from Tralee, and Padraig Óg Ó Ruairc. And I'd just like to thank again the Minister, both for his assistance in setting this up and for his contributions, and for everybody who contributed from the floor, and yourselves for coming along, because I believe we're with a big competition here tonight in Listowel. It's absolutely a throbbing cultural centre. So I'm delighted we had such a good turnout, and thank you all, and I hope you make it to the next head school.